South Africa is facing a severe backlash from the rest of the continent over the recent wave of xenophobic violence in the country. Some of the incidents reported in mainstream media reflect a continental wave of strong and violent reaction to anti-foreign occupation in the country. South African vehicles were pelted with stones in Mozambique. South African companies are reportedly being threatened with closure in Nigeria. In fact, protests have been held at various South African embassies across the continent. Also, several South African musicians were forced to cancel concerts abroad. Let's take a look at this insert produced by JoburgToday.tv's correspondent Riley Sakwe.
South Africa has been under a massive spotlight following the increased number of xenophobic attacks, which sparked in Durban, KwaZulu-Natal, and have now reached Johannesburg in the Gauteng area. We spoke to the powers that be and people on the street to find out how they feel about this issue.
We have received some SMSs in terms of the planned xenophobia attacks, so we alerted the police in terms of arresting those kind of situations so that we become more proactive. And if it happens that there are some incident of xenophobia attacks and lootings in the CBD, especially maybe in Johannesburg, we will keep informing the police and facilitating the processes that the situation doesn't get out of hand.
What I think about the xenophobic attacks, Durban, I think that it is wrong. There are better ways of dealing with it than going around harming, killing people or trying to kill people. I think that nobody deserves to be killed, no matter what reason it is.
Thinking about the government wethu wasathelwa silethela ama-foreign ezweni lethu singalungisa thina izwe lethu silwele thina sikatholi lutho ezweni lethu silwele buka mina nginjani kumanje ngibothokile ezweni lami anginalutho ingane zami lala idlile ezweni lami kodwa lelizwe ngiyalivotela ngathi ngiyalilwela lelizwe kodwa manje yilibuso abantu bangaphandle thina silibuse lelizwe.
It's a very painful situation, you know. We are Africans. You understand? We are Africans. And if you come to look at it now, there are some white foreigners in this country. Those ones are not being tampered with.
Quite disgraceful and so ungodly to see a black going after a black. I mean, I could remember some years back when they are crying, we are also crying with them.
I'm Riley Sakwe for Joburg Today.
Since the first wave of xenophobic violence took place in 2008, there has been several intensive social studies around xenophobia in South Africa. The South African Institute of Race Relations is one such institute. They have described this wave of violence as a direct response to policy failures. Well, to discuss further, I am joined now by the Institute's Meinke Steytler. Welcome, Meinke. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
I think a good place to start would be to look at the debate that has been taking place around what do we label these acts of violence. You prefer to refer to it as criminal acts of violence. But I think there is consensus now that these acts of violence are being perpetrated, carried out by a certain segment of the South African population against black foreign immigrants, participants of the informal sector.
Yes, so it is. It's directed at foreign nationals, and the IRR believes that this is because foreign nationals are easy targets for the huge frustration that people are feeling, and it's also so sad because it's the poor fighting the poor. So someone asked me, what about businessmen, immigrants? What about people coming and working for the banking sector or so forth? They're not being chased down the streets. And I said, well, exactly, this is the thing. It's someone actually equally as poor as they are being attacked for having maybe ever so slightly more. And that is because they're an easy target for the huge frustration in South Africans for the high unemployment, the lack of rule of law, the education system actually failing young people to skill them up properly, and empowerment as well. Empowerment has done a lot for a growing black middle class, but really the majority of the people in our country, the poorest of the poor, actually their circumstances are still the same as they were 20 years ago, and that's all the boiling, it's like a boiling pot of unrest or instability, actually is the better word, that then leads to the unrest.
Sure. Now we are seeing this backlash take place. Actually, I see it more as a whiplash, because this is quite serious for a core country like South South Africa the economic powerhouse of Africa to experience. And I think it speaks directly to the levels of frustration and disappointment that came through back in 2008 when it first raised its infernal head as a serious social dilemma. And I think that speaks directly to some of the issues you've raised in your policy document. Let's start with what you just mentioned, high unemployment. How is that a contributing factor?
So young people, we see in our data, and this is not data that we're making up out of thin air, it's actual data from government, from Stats SA, from the World Bank and so forth, that 52% of South African, in fact, if you want to be really, it's 51.8% of the South African youth are without work. And we would actually surmise that in areas like Alexandra and so forth, you would actually see higher, you'd probably see about 60, 65%. And the reason we believe this is a contributing factor is that there is really nothing to live for these people. They are very frustrated. They're sitting, with potential. They're sitting with energy. They're sitting with, time on their hands. They're young. They're raring to go, and they have nowhere to go. So they start seeing what others have and what they don't have. They're also exposed to popular culture through their phones and, just through advertising and television and so forth, and thinking, well, why do other people have this and I don't? So we believe that if the labor legislation was actually deregularized, if it was made less stringent and it was easier for people to employ young people, then that would be a positive thing. Even a youth wage subsidy, giving companies that do employ young people subsidies and so forth, looking at those policy areas and seeing if we can't bring that 52% and more down and just get more young people seeing a future for themselves, seeing empowerment, seeing, having a reason to live, really.
Yeah. And I actually had the opportunity to chat to a woman that was part of the protest, and she basically said to me not to condone the violence that's taking place, but she was really protesting because she's saying she's part of the disenfranchised sector. And for example, to give you a practical example, domestic workers, foreign domestic workers are currently prepared to accept a wage as low as 10 Rand per day, whereas the current market rate for domestic workers is around 50 Rand. So it's real desperate times. But the question is, how do we resolve this from a policy perspective? What are the challenges to work around lowering the levels of high unemployment?
Yeah, so the challenges are obviously looking at something like the minimum wage. It's something that's ideal. We obviously don't want to go back to slave labor, and it's understandable that some people, like with your example, are not prepared to work for that little money a day. But at the same time, within our economic situation at the moment, with very low economic growth, we're not really in the place for something as the minimum wage. But obviously that's up for debate, and it needs to be debated very carefully. And for us, it's the economy is really key. If we can build the economy, we will actually build people. And then obviously, with regard to foreign nationals coming in and obviously working cheaper for companies, we do feel that companies should be allowed to employ who they like and also negotiate with that individual what they're paid and so forth, and that will eventually really make the economy work and make South Africa work. But it is a challenge to get that balance right. It is a challenge to make sure that people are not, for example, abused. Obviously not physically or verbally, but like abused within their work situation, abused monetarily. So those are the challenges that are quite difficult, because you do want to have South Africans in the jobs, but you also don't really want foreign nationals to come here.
Because we're a global player as well.
We are a global player, and this is the big issue. And we've seen, you mentioned it, we've seen the impact that it's having on our global reputation, the impact that it's having on and the world. Look, we're South Africa, we were isolated for years. We're part of Africa, and we're actually part of the world. And as the community actually becomes smaller with the help of technology, we need to accept that we're part of that. And trade in products is one thing, but trade in skills is another thing.
And this was certainly a thorny issue during wage negotiations during the 2012 mining strikes, which led to the Marikana massacre as well, the issue of low-paid migrant workers.
Yes, exactly. So it is a very sensitive issue, but we do believe that you want people, we really believe that half a loaf is better than no loaf. So what we mean is maybe education is important in that as well, and educating South African workers that you probably are going to have to work for a smallish wage at first, prove yourself. As the company gets more productive, you can be paid more. And in some way, maybe word that in law. So explaining, okay, if you're going to employ someone, make it clear to that person, this is my plan for the company over the next 5 years, and this is how you fit into it. But what you're paid now might not necessarily be 100% what you want, but you need to work for it, because that's the best system there is.
I want to come back to the issue of education, which you've raised in your policy document, but you also mentioned corruption.
Yes.
And migration policy. Let's delve into that.
Yes, so obviously corruption is a huge problem, and it's not only a South African problem, it's a worldwide problem, or for many countries in the world. And it really is the scourge of a lot of the problems faced by South Africa, Africa, and other countries. And South America comes to mind, for example. And organizations like the Public Protector are so important in that role. And obviously Thuli Madonsela is doing a fantastic job. But we as influencers, or even, anyone, a South African citizen or a person living in South Africa, we need to ensure that that role, for example, for her, is actually supported and built. Her tenure is coming to an end. We need to make sure that whoever is appointed in her place will also uphold the same standards she did. We need to start with ourselves. You do not pay a bribe to a policeman or woman. You do not, when you get to a border, you queue with other people. You do not pay a bribe to get through the border quicker because you're better than other people. It really has to come from political will, which we all know the examples, but it also has to come from the ground up as well.
Yeah, it's something that's prevalent across Africa, high levels of corruption and bribery.
It's huge, and it's what brings a lot of people here as well. It's what brings a lot of people, some of what makes people get on boats in Libya and try to get over to the Mediterranean Sea, and it's really, it's almost the worst issue, and we need to start punishing people in the strongest way possible that the law allows. And that counts for senior people as well. We need to make sure that people are held accountable and set an example, because it's really come to a stage now where it's just gone too far.
Meinke, very quickly, what is wrong with our current education system? How is it not serving our youth?
Yes, so unfortunately 80% of our state schools are dysfunctional. It was actually, Angie Mocheka even admitted it, that there was a lot of work to do. What we see in our data is, what you often hear from government, for example, is, the grade 12s have done so beautifully, we have a 78% pass rate. They don't mention at all that 450,000 young people drop out of school in a 12-year school career. So when we look at the number of pupils enrolled in grade 1, it's about 1.2 million, which is about right for that age cohort.
And again, it comes back to high levels of poverty and the cost of going to school.
But then the other thing is, there are schools in the areas, but those schools are in such bad state. The teaching in those schools is so bad that these children then take a bus an hour and an hour back. They are our largest group of commuters every morning in South Africa. 450,000 of them drop out. We want to know, obviously, finance, obviously, teenage pregnancies, working, but we know that they're not working because more than 50% of them don't have work. We want the government to start looking at why are these kids dropping out. And the other thing is only 2% actually pass maths over 50%. And it doesn't mean they don't have the potential, it's a structural problem that needs to be fixed.
Indeed, indeed. I think one of the greatest contributors to sociological thought was Karl Marx, when he, in his theory of the division of labor, pointed out that one of the contradictions of capitalism is the class struggle because of inequality that would eventually emerge out of that. And I think what we are seeing here is that class struggle.
Yes.
In fact, even a revolution taking place in South Africa right now, without wanting to sensationalize the issue, but the fact of the matter is the military has been called in as well.
Yes.
So this is a major social dilemma, and government, bottom line, what you're saying is government has to look at policy issues. Thank you so much for your time today.
Such a pleasure.